Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching the snow fall harder than she had seen in years. The wind was getting stronger, too. It made a loud noise as it pushed against the old farmhouse. The weatherman on the radio had said it would snow, but not like this. This was much worse than anyone expected. She wrapped her thick sweater tighter around her shoulders. The house felt cold even with the heat turned up. Sarah was 32 years old, but sometimes she felt much older. Living alone on the farm made her feel that way. It had been 3 years since her husband David died in that terrible accident at the construction site. 3 long years of trying to keep everything together by herself. The farm was not easy to run alone. There were always things that needed fixing. The barn roof leaked when it rained hard. The fence around the backfield had posts that were starting to rot. The old tractor made strange noises that worried her. But this place was all she had left of David. He had loved this land so much. She could not give it up even when things got really hard. Sarah looked at the clock on the stove. It was almost 7 in the evening. The storm was getting worse every minute. She could barely see the barn through all the snow. The wind was blowing the snow sideways, making it look like white sheets dancing in the air. She had never seen a storm like this one in all her years living in Montana. She turned away from the window and walked to the living room. The old wood stove was working hard to keep the house warm. She put another log on the fire and watched the flames grow bigger. The house creaked and groaned as the wind pushed against it. Sarah was used to these sounds. The house was old, built by David's grandfather many years ago. It had seen many storms, and it was still standing strong. Sarah picked up the picture of David from the table next to her chair. In the photo, he was smiling and wearing his work clothes. His hard hat was under his arm. It was taken just a week before the accident. She touched his face in the picture with her finger. David always knew what to do when storms came. He would check all the animals, make sure the barn was secure, and fill up extra containers with water in case the power went out. Tonight, Sarah would have to do all these things by herself. She put on her heavy coat, boots, and gloves. Before opening the back door, she took a deep breath. The cold air hit her face like a slap when she stepped outside. The wind was so strong it almost knocked her down. Snow was everywhere, covering everything in white. She walked carefully to the chicken coop first. The chickens were all inside, staying warm together. She made sure they had enough food and water for the night. Next, she went to check on Bessie, her old milk cow. Bessie was standing in the corner of her stall, looking calm despite the storm outside. Sarah gave her some extra hay and made sure the water trough was not frozen. The barn was the hardest part. Sarah had to push hard against the big door to open it. The wind wanted to slam it shut again. Inside, she checked that everything was tied down. The storm was so strong it might blow things around. She moved some of the lighter tools to safer places. The old hay bales were stacked high in one corner. David had put them there last fall before he died. She still remembered helping him stack them, laughing when pieces of hay got stuck in her hair. When Sarah finished in the barn, she was very cold. Her hands were so cold they hurt even with her gloves on. She hurried back to the house, fighting against the wind with each step. Once inside, she took off her wet clothes and put on dry ones. Her whole body was shaking from the cold. The lights flickered as she was making herself some hot soup. The power lines were probably having trouble in this storm. Sarah found her flashlights and put fresh batteries in them. She filled up some pots with water from the sink, just in case the power went out and the water pump stopped working. David had taught her to always be ready for anything. She sat down at the kitchen table with her bowl of soup. The radio was still playing, but the sound kept cutting in and out because of the storm. When she could hear it clearly, the weatherman was saying the storm was much bigger than they thought it would be. He said people should stay inside and not drive anywhere unless it was an emergency. Sarah looked around her kitchen. It was the same as when David was alive. She had not changed anything. His coffee cup was still in the same place on the counter. His favorite chair at the table was still pushed back a little, like he might come home any minute and sit down for dinner. Sometimes keeping things the same made her feel better. Other times it made her feel very sad. The wind was getting louder. It sounded like a train passing by the house. Sarah had lived through many storms, but this one felt different. It felt angry and dangerous. She was glad she had checked on all the animals before it got this bad. Now all she could do was wait for it to pass. She tried to watch some television, but the picture kept going in and out. The storm was interfering with everything. So she picked up a book instead. Reading helped her forget about being alone and worried. But tonight, even her favorite book could not keep her mind off the storm outside. Around 9 o'clock, the power finally went out. The house became very quiet without the hum of the refrigerator and the heater. Sarah lit some candles and turned on her battery-powered radio. The wind was still very strong and the snow was still falling hard. The weatherman said the storm might last all night and into the next day. Sarah made herself some hot chocolate on her gas stove. The flame gave a little bit of light and warmth to the dark kitchen. She wondered how many other people were sitting alone tonight, listening to the storm and hoping it would end soon. In weather like this, everyone was just trying to stay safe and warm until morning came. Sarah was sitting in her living room by the wood stove when she heard the sound. At first, she thought it was just the wind making a different noise. But then she heard it again. It was the sound of motors, like motorcycles, but that did not make sense. Who would be riding motorcycles in this terrible storm? She got up from her chair and looked out the front window. Through all the snow, she could see lights moving slowly down the road toward her house. The lights were getting brighter, which meant they were getting closer. Sarah felt her heart start to beat faster. She lived far from town and it was very late at night. Who could be coming to her house in this storm? The sound of the motors got louder. Now she could tell for sure that they were motorcycles. But how many? It sounded like a lot of them. Sarah blew out most of her candles so the house would look dark. She did not want whoever was outside to know she was home. Maybe they would just keep driving and leave her alone. But the motorcycles did not keep driving. They turned into her driveway. Sarah could see the headlights through her front window. Her hands started to shake, and not from the cold this time. She was scared. David was not here to protect her. She was all alone with strangers coming to her house in the middle of a bad storm. Sarah went to the kitchen and looked out the back window. She could see more lights coming up the driveway. How many motorcycles were there? She tried to count the headlights, but they were moving around too much in the snow. It looked like maybe 20 or more. That was a lot of people. The motorcycles stopped near her front gate. Sarah could hear the riders talking to each other, but she could not understand what they were saying over the noise of the wind. She grabbed the phone to call for help, but the phone line was dead. The storm must have knocked down the phone lines somewhere. Someone knocked on her front door. It was a hard, loud knock that made Sarah jump. Then she heard a man's voice calling out. He sounded tired and cold. "Hello? Is anyone home? We need help. Our bikes are dying in this cold." Sarah did not answer. She stayed very still and quiet. Maybe if she did not make any noise, they would think no one was home and go away. The man knocked again, harder this time. "Please, we know someone lives here. We can see smoke coming from your chimney. We're not here to hurt anyone. We just need shelter from this storm." Sarah looked toward the kitchen window. She could see some of the riders getting off their motorcycles. The snow was so deep they had to wade through it. Some of the motorcycles had stopped running. She could see the riders trying to start them again, but the engines would not turn on. "The cold was too much for the machines. Ma'am, we're really sorry to bother you," the man called out again. "But some of our bikes won't start and it's getting too cold out here. We just need somewhere warm to wait until this storm passes." Sarah moved closer to the front door, but she did not open it. Through the door, she could hear more voices now, men talking to each other. Some of them sounded worried. One voice was older than the others, Jake. "I don't think anyone's going to answer," said the older voice. "Someone has to be home." "Murphy," said the man called Jake, "look at all that smoke from the chimney, and there are fresh footprints in the snow leading to the barn." Sarah realized they had seen her footprints from when she went to check on the animals earlier. There was no way to pretend no one was home now. Jake knocked one more time. "Listen, I know you're scared. I would be too if strangers showed up at my door in the middle of the night. But we're not bad people. We were traveling to a charity ride in Billings when this storm hit. We got caught out here, and some of our bikes can't handle this cold. We just need a warm place to wait it out." Sarah pressed her ear to the door. The man sounded honest, but she was still afraid. She had heard stories about motorcycle gangs. They were supposed to be dangerous people who got into fights and broke the law. But this man, Jake, sounded polite and respectful. "We have money," Jake continued. "We can pay you for any trouble. We just need to get out of this wind and cold before someone gets frostbite." Through the window, Sarah could see more riders walking around in the snow. They were all wearing heavy leather jackets and boots. Even in the dark, she could see that some of them were older men with gray hair. One man was limping as he walked like his leg was hurt. The wind was getting stronger and the snow was falling even harder than before. The temperature had to be way below zero. Sarah thought about how cold she had been earlier when she was only outside for a few minutes. These men had been riding motorcycles in this weather. They must be freezing. Please, Jake called out one more time. We're not asking to come in your house. We just need somewhere out of this wind. A barn or a garage. Anywhere that's warmer than out here. Sarah thought about David. He always said their home was open to anyone who needed help. When neighbors had problems, David was always the first person to offer assistance. He helped fix broken cars, shared tools, and even gave food to families who were struggling. David believed that helping others was the right thing to do, especially when they were in trouble. But David was a big, strong man who could protect himself. Sarah was alone and these were strangers. What if they were lying about who they were? What if they wanted to rob her or hurt her? On the other hand, what if they were telling the truth? What if they really were just travelers caught in a bad storm? If she did not help them, some of them might freeze to death out there. Could she live with herself if that happened? Sarah took a deep breath and made her decision. She walked to the front door and put her hand on the doorknob. Her heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. "Who are you?" she called out through the door. "My name is Jake Morrison," came the reply. "I'm with a group of riders from different clubs. We were heading to Billings for a charity ride to raise money for children's hospitals. The storm caught us by surprise." "How many of you are there?" Sarah asked. 20 of us, Jake answered. "I know that sounds like a lot, but we'll stay outside if you want. We just need to get our bikes somewhere out of this wind so we can try to get them started again when the storm passes." Sarah looked out the window again. She could see the men more clearly now. They did look cold and tired. Some of them were stomping their feet and rubbing their hands together to stay warm. One man was trying to help another rider whose motorcycle had fallen over in the snow. "Are you armed?" Sarah asked. She felt silly asking, but she had to know. "We don't have any guns, if that's what you mean," Jake said. "Some of us have pocket knives, but that's just normal stuff. We're not here to cause trouble. We just want to stay warm and safe until we can get back on the road." Sarah made her final decision. She unlocked the front door and opened it just a crack. Through the opening, she could see a tall man with a gray beard. He was wearing a black leather jacket covered with patches. His face looked kind but tired and cold. "I have a barn," Sarah said quietly. "You can put your motorcycles in there and wait out the storm." Sarah opened her front door wider and stepped out into the cold night air. The wind hit her face hard, and snow immediately started sticking to her hair and clothes. Jake Morrison stood in front of her, and she could see he was shivering despite his thick leather jacket. Behind him, the other riders were gathered around their motorcycles waiting to see what would happen. "Thank you," Jake said, and his breath came out like white clouds in the cold air. "I promise we won't cause you any trouble. We just need to get out of this wind." Sarah nodded and pointed toward the barn. "Follow me," she said loudly so all the riders could hear her over the storm. "The barn is big enough for all your bikes." The 20 riders started pushing and riding their motorcycles through the deep snow toward the barn. Some of the bikes were still running, but others had to be pushed because the cold had killed their engines. Sarah walked ahead of them, leading the way with her flashlight. When they reached the barn, Sarah pulled open the big wooden doors. The inside was dark and cold, but it was much better than being outside in the wind and snow. The riders pushed their motorcycles inside and parked them in a line along one wall. Sarah turned on the overhead light, which ran on the emergency generator that David had installed years ago. In the light, Sarah got her first good look at the group of men. They were not what she had expected at all. Yes, they were wearing leather jackets and looked tough, but they also looked like regular people. Some were young, maybe in their 20s. Others were older, with gray hair and wrinkled faces. One man looked like he could be a grandfather. Another man had a military pin on his jacket that said Vietnam Veteran. "This is really nice of you," said an older man with white hair. His jacket had patches that said Murphy and Road Captain. "Most people would be too scared to help strangers like us." Sarah looked around at all the men. Now that she could see them clearly, she realized they did not look dangerous. They looked tired and cold and grateful. "Everyone gets caught in bad weather sometimes," she said. "I know what it's like to need help." Jake was checking on his motorcycle, trying to see if the cold had damaged the engine. "Ma'am, we don't even know your name," he said. "I'm Jake, and this is Murphy, Bobby, Tank Red, and the rest of the guys." He pointed to different riders as he said their names. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she said. "This is my farm." "Well, Sarah Mitchell, you might have saved our lives tonight," said a younger rider with red hair who must have been Red. "The temperature is dropping fast out there. A few more hours in that wind and we would have been in real trouble." Sarah looked at the men again. They were still shivering, and their clothes were wet from the snow. The barn was warmer than outside, but it was still very cold. She made another decision that surprised even herself. "Wait here," she told them. "I'll be right back." Sarah ran back to the house through the storm. In her bedroom, she pulled out all the extra blankets she had. David's old sleeping bags were in the closet, and she grabbed those too. In the kitchen, she started making coffee in the biggest pot she had. She also put a large pot of water on the stove to make soup. 20 minutes later, Sarah returned to the barn carrying blankets, sleeping bags, and a thermos of hot coffee. The riders looked surprised to see her coming back. "You don't have to do this," Jake said as Sarah started handing out blankets. "Letting us use your barn is already more than enough." "It's cold in here," Sarah said simply. "These will help keep you warm." She gave the sleeping bags to the older riders first, thinking they probably needed the warmth more than the younger ones. Murphy wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and sighed with relief. "This feels wonderful," he said. "How can we pay you for this kindness?" "You don't need to pay me anything," Sarah replied. She poured coffee into cups and started handing them out. "Just get warm and stay safe." As the riders drank their coffee and wrapped themselves in blankets, they started to talk more. Sarah learned that they were not all from one motorcycle club. They were from several different groups who had come together for the charity ride in Billings. The event was to raise money for a children's hospital that needed new equipment. "We do this ride every year," explained Bobby, a man in his 50s with kind eyes. "Last year we raised $50,000. The year before that it was $45,000. The kids really need that money for their medical care." Tank, who was the biggest of all the riders, showed Sarah a picture in his wallet. "This is my granddaughter Emma," he said proudly. "She's 7 years old. She had to go to the children's hospital last year when she got really sick. The doctors and nurses there were amazing. That's why I ride in this charity event every year." Sarah was surprised by how normal these men were. They talked about their families, their jobs, and their problems just like anyone else. Red worked at an auto repair shop. Murphy was a retired police officer. Jake owned a small construction company. Several of them were veterans who had served in different wars. "What about you, Sarah?" asked Jake. "Do you live here alone?" Sarah felt sad for a moment, but she answered honestly. "My husband David died 3 years ago in an accident at work. I've been running the farm by myself since then." The riders all got quiet when she said this. Finally, Murphy spoke up. "I'm sorry for your loss. That must be very hard." "It is hard sometimes," Sarah admitted, "but David loved this place. He would want me to keep it going." Jake looked around the barn. "Your husband built all this?" "His grandfather built the house in the original barn," Sarah explained. "David fixed it up and made it bigger. He was very good at building things and fixing things that were broken." "He sounds like he was a good man," said Bobby. "He was the best man I ever knew," Sarah said quietly. After a while, Sarah went back to the house to check on the soup she was making. When it was ready, she brought it to the barn in a large pot with bowls and spoons. The riders were amazed that she would cook for them too. "Nobody has ever been this kind to us," said Red as he ate his soup. "Most people see our leather jackets and motorcycles and think we're troublemakers. People judge too quickly sometimes," Sarah said. "My husband always told me to look at what people do, not just how they look." The riders spent the rest of the night in the barn, sleeping on the hay bales with their blankets and sleeping bags. Sarah went back to the house, but she did not sleep much. She kept listening to make sure everything was quiet outside. She was still a little nervous about having 20 strangers on her property, but so far they had been nothing but polite and grateful. Around 4 in the morning, the wind finally started to get quieter. The snow was still falling, but not as hard as before. Sarah made more coffee and took it out to the barn. She found that Jake was already awake, sitting by the barn doors and looking out at the storm. "How's it looking out there?" Sarah asked as she handed him a cup of coffee. "Better," Jake said. "I think the worst of it has passed. We should be able to get back on the road in a few hours when it gets light." "Are you sure your motorcycles will start?" Sarah asked. "It's still very cold," Jake nodded. "Most of them should be okay now that they've been out of the wind. The guys who know about engines will help the ones whose bikes are having trouble." Sarah looked around the barn at the sleeping riders. They looked peaceful and comfortable. despite sleeping on hay bales. "They seem like good men," she said. "They are," Jake replied. "We may look tough on the outside, but most of us are just regular guys who like to ride motorcycles and help people when we can. That's what the charity ride is all about." As the sun began to rise, more of the riders started to wake up. They folded their blankets neatly and rolled up the sleeping bags. Sarah was impressed by how clean they kept everything. They did not leave any trash or make any mess in her barn. By 7 in the morning, the storm had finally stopped. The sun was coming up, and Sarah could see just how much snow had fallen during the night. There was at least 3 feet of snow everywhere. Her driveway was completely blocked, and the road to town was probably impassable too. All 20 riders were awake now, drinking coffee and getting ready to check their motorcycles. Sarah had made breakfast for them: scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast. She brought it all out to the barn on large plates. The men were so grateful they could barely find words to thank her. "Sarah, you have done more for us than our own families would do," said Murphy as he ate his breakfast. "We will never forget your kindness." Jake stood up and looked around at all the other riders. "Before we do anything else, we need to help Sarah with this snow. Look at her driveway. She's going to be snowed in for days if we don't clear it." "That's not necessary," Sarah said quickly. "You need to get to your charity ride." "The charity ride got postponed because of the storm," Bobby explained. "They moved it to next weekend, so we have time to help you out." Tank, the biggest rider, was already putting on his gloves. "My dad always taught me that when someone helps you, you help them back twice as much." Without being asked, all 20 riders started working together to clear Sarah's driveway. Some of them used shovels from her barn. Others used pieces of wood to push the snow. The younger riders did the heavy lifting while the older ones directed where to pile the snow. Sarah watched in amazement as these tough-looking men worked together like a well-organized team. They did not complain about the cold or the hard work. They just kept shoveling and pushing snow until her long driveway was clear all the way to the road. "How did you learn to work together so well?" Sarah asked Jake as he took a break from shoveling. "When you ride motorcycles in groups, you learn to take care of each other," Jake explained. "If one person has trouble, everybody stops to help. If someone's bike breaks down, we all work together to fix it. It's just the way we do things." After the driveway was clear, Red noticed that the gate at the front of Sarah's property was hanging crooked. "This gate is about to fall off its hinges," he told the others. "I've been meaning to fix that for months," Sarah said, "but I don't really know how." "We can fix it right now," said Bobby, who worked as a carpenter during the week. "It just needs some new bolts and maybe a little welding." While Bobby and a few others worked on the gate, the rest of the riders found other things that needed fixing around the farm. They stacked firewood that had been scattered by the wind. They repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree branch. They even fixed the door on the chicken coop that had been sticking shut. Sarah could not believe how much work they were getting done. Things that would have taken her weeks to finish by herself were being completed in just a few hours. The riders worked as if they were helping their own family member. Around noon, most of the motorcycles were ready to go. The riders had warmed up the engines and checked all the parts to make sure nothing was damaged by the cold. A few bikes needed small repairs, but the men who knew about engines were able to fix them quickly. "We should probably get going soon," Jake told Sarah. "We want to be back in town before it gets dark, just in case another storm comes through." Sarah felt sad to see them getting ready to leave. In just one night, these 20 strangers had become like friends to her. They had worked harder to help her than some people she had known for years. "Before you go," Sarah said, "let me give you some food for the road." She went into the house and came back with sandwiches, fruit, and bottles of water for each rider. "You don't have to keep feeding us," Red said with a smile. "You've already done way too much." "I want to," Sarah replied. "It's a long ride to wherever you're going." As the riders got ready to leave, they all came up to Sarah to say goodbye and thank her personally. Murphy hugged her like she was his own daughter. Tank showed her more pictures of his granddaughter. Bobby gave her his business card and told her to call him if she ever needed any carpentry work done. Jake was the last one to say goodbye. He pulled out a piece of paper and wrote down Sarah's address. "I hope you don't mind, but I want to keep in touch," he said. "What you did for us last night was special. You didn't know us and you had every reason to be scared, but you helped us anyway." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Sarah said. Jake shook his head. "No, they wouldn't have. Most people would have pretended they weren't home and hoped we went away. You took a risk to help strangers, and that says something important about who you are." Before getting on his motorcycle, Jake took out his phone and made a call. Sarah could hear him talking to someone, but she could not understand what he was saying because of the noise from the other motorcycles starting up. "Who were you calling?" Sarah asked when Jake finished his phone call. "Just letting some friends know about your kindness," Jake said with a mysterious smile. "Word travels fast in our community when someone does something really special." One by one, the motorcycles roared to life. The sound was loud but not scary anymore. Now it sounded friendly to Sarah, like a group of friends saying goodbye. The riders waved as they drove down her newly cleared driveway and turned onto the road toward town. Sarah stood by her front gate and watched until the last motorcycle disappeared over the hill. Then she walked back to her house, feeling more alone than she had felt in a long time. For just one night, her quiet farm had been full of voices and activity. Now everything was silent again except for the wind blowing through the trees. She went inside and looked around her kitchen. The riders had washed all the dishes before leaving and even cleaned up the barn. They had left everything neater than they found it. On the kitchen table, Sarah found an envelope with her name written on it. Inside the envelope was $500 in cash and a note that said, "Thank you for saving our lives. Use this money to buy whatever you need for the farm. Your friends, Jake and the boys." Sarah sat down at the kitchen table and cried. She cried because she was touched by their kindness. She cried because she missed David and wished he could have met these good men. And she cried because for the first time in 3 years, she had felt like she was part of something bigger than just her own lonely world. Later that afternoon, Sarah called her neighbor Mrs. Henderson to tell her about the strange night she had experienced. Mrs. Henderson lived a mile away and was the closest thing Sarah had to family in the area. 20 bikers? Mrs. Henderson said in shock. "Sarah, you could have been killed." "What were you thinking?" "They were good people, Mrs. Henderson," Sarah explained. "They helped me more than they helped themselves. They fixed my gate and cleared my whole driveway." "Well, I suppose you were lucky," Mrs. Henderson said, still sounding worried. "But promise me you'll be more careful next time." Sarah promised, but in her heart she knew she would make the same choice again. David had always said that helping people in need was never wrong, even if it was scary sometimes. These riders had needed help, and she had been able to give it to them. That felt right to her. As evening came, Sarah sat by her wood stove and thought about everything that had happened. She wondered where the riders were now, and whether they had made it safely to wherever they were going. She hoped they would remember her as kindly as she would remember them. Outside, the snow was starting to melt a little in the afternoon sun, but there was still plenty left on the ground. It would be days before the roads were completely clear. Sarah was glad the riders had gotten out when they did. She did not know that tomorrow would bring an even bigger surprise than the one she had experienced last night. Sarah woke up the next morning feeling better than she had in weeks. The sun was shining brightly through her bedroom window, making the snow outside sparkle like diamonds. She had slept well for the first time in months, maybe because helping the riders had made her feel useful and needed again. She got dressed and went to the kitchen to make coffee. While it was brewing, she looked out the window toward the barn where the riders had spent the night. Everything looked normal and peaceful. It was hard to believe that just 24 hours ago, her quiet farm had been full of 20 strangers seeking shelter from the storm. Sarah decided to go outside and check on her animals. The chickens were happy to see her and came running when she brought them their morning food. Bessie the cow was doing fine too, though she seemed curious about all the new footprints in the snow around her stall. "You missed all the excitement, Bessie," Sarah said as she milked the cow. "We had visitors last night. Good people, even though they looked a little scary at first." After finishing her morning chores, Sarah went back inside to eat breakfast. She was scrambling eggs when she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was the rumble of motorcycle engines, but this time it was much louder than the night before. Much, much louder. Sarah ran to the front window and looked out. What she saw made her heart stop. Coming down the road toward her farm was the biggest group of motorcycles she had ever seen. Not 20 this time, but hundreds and hundreds of them. The line of motorcycles stretched so far down the road that she could not see where it ended. The sound was incredible. It was like thunder that never stopped, or like a freight train that went on forever. The ground under Sarah's feet was actually shaking from the vibrations of all those engines. She had never heard anything so loud in her entire life. Sarah's hands started shaking as she watched the massive group of motorcycles get closer to her gate. There were so many of them that the road was completely filled from one side to the other. She tried to count them, but there were too many. 500? 1,000? Maybe even more than that. Fear filled Sarah's chest like ice water. What did all these people want with her? Had she done something wrong by helping Jake and his friends? Were these dangerous people coming to hurt her? She ran to the phone, but it was still not working from the storm. The motorcycles were slowing down as they reached her property. Sarah could see riders wearing all kinds of leather jackets with different patches and colors. Some jackets said Hell's Angels. Others said names like Banditos, Outlaws, and Mongols. These were names Sarah had heard on the news, usually in scary stories about motorcycle gangs and violence. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to figure out what to do. She was completely alone on her farm, miles from the nearest neighbor. Even if Mrs. Henderson heard all this noise, what could an old woman do to help? There was nowhere for Sarah to run and nowhere to hide. The first motorcycles had reached her front gate now, and more were pulling up behind them. Sarah could see riders getting off their bikes, but she was too frightened to get close enough to the window to see what they were doing. The rumbling of engines was so loud she could not hear anything else. Then suddenly most of the engines shut off. The silence that followed was almost as shocking as the noise had been. Sarah could hear her own heart beating and her own breathing, but nothing else. It was like the whole world was holding its breath. Sarah forced herself to look out the window again. She could see hundreds of riders standing next to their motorcycles. They were not moving toward her house yet, but they were all looking in her direction. Some of them were pointing at her farmhouse and talking to each other. In the middle of all these strangers, Sarah saw a familiar face. It was Jake, the man who had led the group of 20 riders the night before. He was walking toward her front door with several other men. Sarah did not know whether to feel relieved or more scared. At least Jake had seemed like a good person. But why had he brought all these others with him? Jake knocked on her front door just like he had the night before. But this time his knock was gentler and his voice was different when he called out to her. "Sarah, it's Jake Morrison. I'm here with some friends. We're not here to cause trouble. We came to thank you for what you did for us last night." Sarah did not move toward the door. Through the window, she could see more motorcycles still arriving. The line seemed to go on forever down the road. "There are so many of you," she called back through the door. "What do you all want?" "Word spread about your kindness," Jake replied. "In our world, when someone does something really special for riders in need, the news travels fast. People wanted to come and meet the woman who risked her safety to help 20 strangers." Sarah looked out the window again. She could see riders of all ages. Some looked very young, maybe in their early 20s. Others had gray hair and looked like they could be grandfathers. There were even a few women among the riders wearing their own leather jackets and looking just as tough as the men. "Are you all from the same motorcycle club?" Sarah asked through the door. "No, we're from many different clubs," Jake explained. "Hell's Angels, Banditos, Outlaws, Mongols, and dozens of smaller groups. We don't always get along with each other. But what you did brought us all together. We heard about a woman who showed real kindness to our brothers, and we wanted to honor that." Sarah's fear was starting to mix with confusion. "Honor what?" "I just gave them a place to stay warm. Anyone would have done the same thing." "No, Sarah, they wouldn't have," said a new voice. This voice was deeper and older than Jake's. "Most people see our leather and our patches and assume we're dangerous. They lock their doors and pretend they're not home. You opened your door and your heart to strangers who needed help." Through the window, Sarah could see that the man with the deep voice was huge and had a long gray beard. His leather jacket had more patches on it than any of the others, and the other riders seemed to treat him with respect. When he talked, everyone else listened. "My name is Samuel," the big man continued. "I'm the president of the Regional Hells Angels chapter. Jake called me yesterday and told me what happened here. I've been riding motorcycles for 40 years, and I have never heard of anyone showing such kindness to a group of bikers." Sarah pressed her face against the door, trying to understand what was happening. "But why did you all come here?" "There are so many of you. The whole road is full of motorcycles." "Because what you did was special," Samuel replied. "In our community, we take care of people who take care of us. You helped our brothers when they needed it most, and now we want to help you." Jake spoke up again. "Sarah, I know this looks scary. I know having 1,000 bikers show up at your house is probably the most frightening thing that's ever happened to you. But I promise you we're here as friends. We're here to honor you and to make sure you know how much your kindness meant to us." Sarah looked out at the sea of motorcycles and riders filling her property and stretching down the road. It was the most incredible sight she had ever seen. Part of her was still scared, but another part of her was starting to feel curious. If they wanted to hurt her, they probably would have done it already instead of standing around talking politely through her front door. "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked. "We want to meet you," Samuel said. "We want to shake your hand and thank you personally. And we want to make sure you know that you have friends in the motorcycle community now. More friends than you could ever count." Sarah took a deep breath and made another brave decision. She unlocked her front door and opened it slowly. Standing on her porch were Jake, Samuel, and 3 other men she did not recognize. Behind them, she could see hundreds and hundreds of motorcycle riders watching her with curious but respectful faces. In the daylight, Sarah could see Jake more clearly than she had the night before. He was wearing different clothes now. Instead of the plain leather jacket he had worn during the storm, he was now wearing a jacket covered with patches. The biggest patch said Hell's Angels with a skull and wings design. Below that was another patch that said, "Jake Morrison, Road Captain." "You're a Hell's Angel," Sarah said quietly. It was not a question. Jake nodded. "I am. I didn't tell you that last night because I was afraid it would scare you. Most people are frightened when they hear that name. But Sarah, I want you to know that everything I told you was true. We were going to a charity ride and we really did need help." Samuel stepped forward. He was even bigger than Sarah had thought when she saw him through the window. He had to be at least 6.5 feet tall with huge arms and hands. But his voice was gentle when he spoke to her. "Mrs. Mitchell, what you did for our brothers last night has never happened before in my 40 years of riding. No one has ever opened their home to a group of bikers the way you did. No one has ever shown such trust and kindness to complete strangers who looked as rough as we do." Sarah looked out at the incredible scene in front of her property. There were motorcycles everywhere, more than she could count. Riders were standing next to their bikes, all of them watching her and waiting to see what would happen next. "How did so many of you find out about last night?" Sarah asked. "Jake called me as soon as they got to town yesterday," Samuel explained. "I called the presidents of other chapters. They called their members. Within a few hours, bikers from 5 different states were getting on their motorcycles to come here." One of the other men stepped forward. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with white hair and kind eyes. "Ma'am, my name is Carlos Rodriguez. I'm the president of the Bandidos chapter from Colorado. I drove all night to get here because I had to meet the woman who showed such courage and kindness." The 4th man looked like he might be Native American. He had long black hair and wore turquoise jewelry with his leather jacket. "I'm Thomas Crow Feather," he said. "I represent several tribal riding groups from Montana and Wyoming. What you did honors the old ways of hospitality and helping strangers. My people respect that very much." Sarah felt overwhelmed by all the attention. "I really didn't do anything special. I just let some cold people get warm in my barn." "You did much more than that," Jake said. "You fed us, gave us blankets, made us coffee, and treated us like honored guests instead of dangerous strangers. You looked past our appearance and saw that we were just people who needed help." Samuel reached into his jacket and pulled out something wrapped in black cloth. "Mrs. Mitchell, we want to give you something that has never been given to anyone outside our brotherhood before." He unwrapped the cloth and showed Sarah what was inside. It was a leather patch with the Hell's Angels colors and logo, but it was different from the patches on the men's jackets. This one had special words embroidered on it in gold thread. "This is an honorary membership patch," Samuel explained. "It has never been given to a civilian before, and it has never been given to a woman. But what you did was so extraordinary that all the chapter presidents agreed. You deserve this honor." Sarah stared at the patch in amazement. "What does this mean?" "It means you are under our protection," Carlos said. "Forever. Anyone who tries to hurt you or cause trouble for you will have to answer to us." "All of us," Thomas nodded in agreement. "It means you have brothers and sisters in the motorcycle community all across the country. If you ever need anything anywhere, you can call on us for help." Jake smiled. "It also means you're invited to any of our events. Charity rides, cookouts, holiday parties. You're part of our family now." Sarah felt tears coming to her eyes. She had been alone for 3 years, struggling to keep David's farm running by herself. Now suddenly, she had hundreds of new friends who wanted to protect her and include her in their lives. "I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered. "Just say you'll accept our friendship," Samuel replied, "and let us do something to help you the way you helped our brothers." Before Sarah could answer, she heard the sound of more motorcycles coming down the road. She looked and saw that even more riders were arriving. The line of motorcycles now stretched further than she could see in both directions. "How many people are here?" Sarah asked in amazement. Jake looked around and did a quick estimate. "Close to 1,000, I think. Maybe more." Word is still spreading and more groups are on their way. A woman rider pushed through the crowd and walked up to Sarah's porch. She was wearing a leather jacket with patches that said, "Ladies of Harley," and looked to be about Sarah's age. She had short blonde hair and a friendly smile. "Hi, Sarah. My name is Linda Patterson. I drove here from Utah with my riding group because we had to meet you. What you did shows the kind of strength and kindness that we admire in women." More riders started coming forward to introduce themselves. There was Mike, a Vietnam veteran who rode with a group called Rolling Thunder. There was Maria, a nurse from New Mexico who belonged to a Christian motorcycle association. There was Big Tom, who looked scary but turned out to be a kindergarten teacher, who rode with a group that raised money for children's charities. Sarah was amazed by the variety of people. These were not the dangerous criminals she had imagined when she thought about motorcycle gangs. They were teachers, nurses, mechanics, business owners, veterans, and retirees. They came from all walks of life, but they all shared a love of motorcycles and a strong sense of loyalty to each other. "We want to do some work around your farm," Samuel said. "Jake told us about all the things that need fixing here. We have carpenters, electricians, mechanics, and people who know about farming. Let us spend the day helping you get this place in better shape." Sarah looked around at her property. There were indeed many things that needed repair. The barn roof still leaked. Several fence posts were rotting. The old tractor needed work. The house could use a new coat of paint. These were all jobs that would cost her thousands of dollars if she hired people to do them. "I can't pay you for all that work," Sarah said. Carlos laughed. "We don't want your money, Mrs. Mitchell. We want to repay your kindness. In our world, when someone helps us, we help them back 10 times more." Thomas nodded. "Besides, we brought our own tools and materials. We came prepared to work." Sarah looked out at the sea of motorcycles and riders. She could see that many of them had trailers attached to their bikes filled with tools and supplies. Some riders were already unloading lumber, paint, roofing materials, and equipment. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked. "There are so many of you. Won't it be too much trouble?" Jake put his hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Sarah, you saved 20 men from possibly freezing to death in that storm. You did it without asking for anything in return. Now we want to save your farm and make sure you never have to struggle alone again." Sarah felt the tears running down her cheeks now. She looked at the honorary patch in Samuel's hands, then at the hundreds of kind faces watching her with respect and affection. "Yes," she said quietly. "Yes, I accept your friendship. And yes, I would be honored to have your help." The crowd of bikers erupted in cheers and applause. Engines roared as riders revved their motorcycles in celebration. Sarah had never heard such a loud, joyful sound in her life. Within minutes of Sarah accepting their offer of help, the massive gathering of bikers transformed into the most organized work crew Sarah had ever seen. Samuel, Jake, and the other leaders divided everyone into teams based on their skills and the jobs that needed to be done. The carpenters went to work on the barn roof that had been leaking for 2 years. They had brought new shingles, wood, and all the tools they needed. Sarah watched in amazement as they climbed up on the roof and started tearing off the old damaged materials. The mechanics surrounded Sarah's old tractor, which had been making strange noises for months. Within an hour, they had the engine apart and were replacing worn-out parts with new ones they had brought with them. "This tractor will run like new when we're done," promised Mike, the Vietnam veteran who owned his own repair shop. A team of painters started working on Sarah's house. They had scraped off the old peeling paint and were putting on a fresh coat of white paint that made the house look 20 years younger. The women riders organized themselves into a cleaning crew and started washing windows, sweeping porches, and organizing Sarah's storage areas. Linda Patterson, the woman from Utah, took charge of the kitchen. "You're going to need to feed this army," she told Sarah with a laugh. "Don't worry, we brought our own food. We just need to use your kitchen to cook it." Soon, Sarah's kitchen was full of women preparing a huge meal. They had brought hamburgers, hot dogs, salads, and all kinds of side dishes. The smell of cooking food filled the house, and Sarah realized it had been a long time since her home had felt so alive and full of activity. Outside, more work teams were busy everywhere Sarah looked. Some riders were fixing her fence, replacing rotten posts with new ones. Others were repairing the gate that Bobby had fixed the day before, making it even stronger and adding new hinges. A group of younger riders was cleaning up debris that had blown around her property during the storm. The most amazing thing to Sarah was how well all these people worked together. She had expected that bikers from different clubs might not get along with each other, but they were cooperating like they had been friends for years. Hell's Angels worked alongside Banditos. Outlaws helped Mongols carry heavy materials. Everyone seemed focused on the same goal of helping Sarah. Around noon, cars started driving slowly past Sarah's farm on the main road. Word had spread through the small town about the massive gathering of motorcycles, and curious people were coming to see what was happening. Some cars stopped, and their drivers got out to take pictures of all the motorcycles lined up along the road. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah's elderly neighbor, drove up in her old pickup truck. She looked worried as she walked toward Sarah's front porch where Sarah was sitting and watching all the work being done. "Sarah, honey, are you all right?" Mrs. Henderson asked nervously. "The whole town is talking about all these motorcycle people being here. Some folks are scared and thinking about calling the police." Sarah stood up and smiled. "Mrs. Henderson, these are the kindest people I've ever met. They're fixing everything on my farm that needs repair, and they won't take any money for it." Mrs. Henderson looked around at all the activity. She could see bikers on her barn roof, others painting her house, and still others working in her yard. "But Sarah, these are Hell's Angels and those other rough groups. Aren't you frightened?" Before Sarah could answer, Samuel walked up to them. Despite his huge size and intimidating appearance, he spoke politely to Mrs. Henderson. "Ma'am, I'm Samuel Davis, president of the Regional Hell's Angels. I want you to know that your neighbor Sarah is a very special lady. She helped some of our members during the storm, and we're here to thank her." Mrs. Henderson looked up at Samuel with wide eyes. She had probably never been this close to a Hell's Angel before. "You're really here to help her?" she asked uncertainly. "Yes, ma'am," Samuel replied. "Sarah showed extraordinary kindness to our brothers when they needed it most. Now we're making sure her farm is in perfect condition so she doesn't have to struggle with repairs anymore." Thomas Crowfeather joined the conversation. "We've also set up a trust fund to help with her ongoing expenses. Sarah will never have to worry about money for farm maintenance again." Mrs. Henderson's mouth dropped open. "A trust fund? You've set up a trust fund for Sarah?" Jake walked over carrying some papers. "It's all legal and official. We've already put $50,000 into it, and more money is coming from other chapters around the country. Sarah helped our people, so now we're taking care of her future." Sarah felt dizzy when she heard the amount of money. $50,000? That's more money than I've seen in 3 years. "It's the least we can do," Carlos said as he joined the group. "My chapter alone wanted to contribute $20,000. When word gets out about this story, I think the fund will grow to over $100,000. By this time, more townspeople had arrived to see what was happening. The local newspaper editor, Jim Walsh, was taking pictures and interviewing some of the bikers. The mayor, Bob Stevens, had come out to make sure everything was peaceful. Mayor Stevens approached Sarah and the group of bikers cautiously. "Is everything all right here, Sarah?" he asked. "Some people in town are worried about having so many motorcycles around," Samuel answered before Sarah could speak. "Mr. Mayor, we understand people's concerns, but we're here peacefully to help a woman who showed great kindness to our community. We've been working all day to improve her property and will be leaving before dark." "What exactly did Sarah do?" Mayor Stevens asked. Jake explained about the storm, how Sarah had sheltered them in her barn, fed them, and given them blankets. He told about how she had trusted them even though she was alone and afraid. "She saved our lives," Jake concluded. "Now we're making sure she knows she has friends who will always be there for her." The mayor looked around at all the work being done. Sarah's farm looked better than it had in years. The house was freshly painted, the barn had a new roof, the fences were repaired, and everything was clean and organized. "This is remarkable," Mayor Stevens said. "Sarah, the whole town has been worried about you trying to keep this farm running by yourself. It looks like you found some very good friends." As the afternoon went on, more and more townspeople came to see what was happening. Many of them had known Sarah since she was a child, and they were amazed to see the transformation of her property. Some people brought homemade food to share with the bikers, others offered to help with the work, though the bikers politely explained that they had everything under control. The local television news crew arrived around 3 o'clock. The reporter, Nancy Coleman, interviewed Sarah about her experience during the storm and how she had decided to help the 20 strangers. "I just did what my husband would have done," Sarah told the camera. "David always said our door was open to anyone who needed help. When I saw those men were cold and their motorcycles weren't working, I couldn't just leave them outside in that terrible storm." Nancy also interviewed several of the bikers, asking them why they had come from so far away to help one woman. "In our community, acts of genuine kindness are rare and precious," Samuel explained to the reporter. "When someone risks their own safety to help our members, word spreads quickly. Sarah represents the best of human nature, and we want to honor that." The story was broadcast on the evening news that night and picked up by national news networks the next day. Within a week, Sarah's story was being told all across the country. She received letters and cards from people who had been touched by her simple act of kindness. But the most important change was in Sarah's daily life. She was no longer alone on the farm. Jake and several other bikers had become regular visitors, stopping by to check on her and help with any problems that came up. Linda and the other women riders stayed in touch too, calling her regularly and inviting her to their events. The local community's attitude toward Sarah changed as well. People who had barely spoken to her before now went out of their way to be friendly and helpful. The story of her kindness had made everyone in town proud to know her. Most importantly, Sarah felt like she had a purpose again. For 3 years after David's death, she had been just surviving day by day. Now she felt connected to a large, caring community that valued the same things she and David had always believed in: helping others and treating strangers with kindness and respect. 6 months after that snowy February night when 20 cold bikers knocked on her door, Sarah's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. The trust fund that the motorcycle community had established for her had grown to over $100,000, just as Carlos had predicted. Money continued to arrive from biker groups all across North America as word of her story spread. But the money was not the most important change in Sarah's life. The most important change was that she was no longer alone. Jake had become like a brother to her, stopping by at least twice a week to check on things and help with any problems. Linda and the other women riders had become her closest female friends, filling a gap in her life that had been empty since David's death. Sarah had decided to use some of the trust fund money to start a small bed and breakfast business on her farm. With help from her new biker friends, she had renovated David's old workshop into 3 comfortable guest rooms. The business was called Mitchell's Haven, and it specialized in providing lodging for traveling motorcycle riders. Word about Mitchell's Haven spread quickly through the motorcycle community. Riders who were traveling long distances would plan their routes to include a stop at Sarah's farm. She served home-cooked meals, provided secure parking for motorcycles, and offered the kind of warm hospitality that had become legendary among bikers. Sarah loved running the bed and breakfast. It meant her home was often full of interesting people with fascinating stories to tell. She learned about different parts of the country from riders who had traveled everywhere. She heard about charity events, motorcycle rallies, and the tight-knit communities that existed within the biker world. On a warm Saturday morning in August, Sarah was in her garden picking vegetables for breakfast when she heard the familiar sound of motorcycles coming up her driveway. She smiled, wondering which of her regular visitors was arriving early. But when she looked up, she saw something that made her laugh with joy. It was Jake, but he was not alone. Behind him were at least 50 other riders, including Samuel, Carlos, Thomas, Linda, and many others she recognized from that amazing day in February. "Surprise," Jake called out as he parked his motorcycle. "We decided it was time for a reunion." The riders had come to celebrate the 6-month anniversary of their first meeting. They had brought food for a huge barbecue, and they planned to spend the whole weekend at Sarah's farm. Some would stay in her bed and breakfast rooms. Others would camp in the field behind the barn, just like they had done during charity rides. As Sarah hugged her friends and welcomed them to her home, she thought about how much her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a lonely widow struggling to keep her farm running. Today, she was a successful business owner surrounded by loyal friends who treated her like family. "I have some news to share with everyone," Sarah announced after they had finished eating lunch. "I've decided to start a nonprofit organization." The bikers gathered around to hear what she had to say. Sarah felt nervous but excited as she explained her idea. I want to create a program that helps people who get stranded during bad weather or emergencies, she said. It would be called Haven Network, and it would connect travelers with local families who are willing to provide emergency shelter. Samuel nodded approvingly. Like what you did for us that night. Exactly, Sarah replied. I've learned that there are many people like me who would be willing to help strangers in need, but they don't know how to connect with people who need help. And there are many travelers who need emergency shelter but don't know where to find it. Jake was smiling broadly. Sarah, that's a wonderful idea. How can we help you make it happen? I was hoping you would ask that, Sarah said with a grin. The motorcycle community could be perfect for spreading the word about Haven Network. You travel everywhere and you know people in every state. You could help identify both travelers who might need emergency shelter and families who would be willing to provide it. Linda stood up and applauded. I love this idea. Our women's riding group would be happy to help organize it. Carlos pulled out his phone. I'm going to start making calls right now. I know chapter presidents in 40 states who would want to be part of this. As the weekend continued, Sarah's reunion party turned into a planning session for Haven Network. The bikers used their extensive contacts to begin building a nationwide network of safe havens for stranded travelers. They created phone numbers people could call for help, and they established procedures for verifying that both the travelers and the host families were legitimate. By Sunday evening, they had the framework for a program that could help thousands of people every year. Sarah realized that her simple act of kindness on one snowy night was going to create a legacy that would help people for many years to come. On Monday morning, after all her friends had left, Sarah sat on her front porch with her coffee and thought about everything that had happened. The farm looked beautiful. Her bed and breakfast business was thriving. She had more close friends than she had ever had in her life, and now she had a new purpose that would honor David's memory by helping others. Mrs. Henderson drove up while Sarah was sitting on the porch. The elderly woman had become one of Sarah's biggest supporters, and she often stopped by to hear the latest news about the Haven Network project. How was your reunion weekend? Mrs. Henderson asked as she joined Sarah on the porch. It was wonderful, Sarah replied. We planned a whole program to help travelers who get caught in emergencies. It's going to help so many people. Mrs. Henderson shook her head in amazement. Sarah, when I think about how scared I was that first day when all those motorcycles showed up, I feel silly. Those people have become the best thing that ever happened to you. They have, Sarah agreed. But you know what the really amazing part is? None of this would have happened if I had been too afraid to open my door that night. If I had just pretended I wasn't home and waited for them to go away, my life would still be exactly the same as it was before. What made you decide to help them? Mrs. Henderson asked. Most people would have been too frightened. Sarah thought about the question for a moment. I think it was David's influence. He always said that when people need help, you help them first and worry about the details later. That night during the storm, I could see that those men were cold and their motorcycles weren't working. They needed help, so I helped them. Mrs. Henderson patted Sarah's hand. David would be so proud of you. Look at everything that grew from one simple act of kindness. That evening, Sarah called Jake to thank him again for organizing the reunion weekend. During their conversation, Jake told her something that made her realize just how far-reaching her influence had become. Sarah, I want you to know that your story has changed how our entire community thinks about interacting with the public, Jake said. Before that night at your farm, many of us assumed that regular people would never accept us or treat us with respect. Your kindness showed us that there are good people everywhere who will help others regardless of appearances. I'm glad, Sarah replied, because I learned the same thing about all of you. I thought motorcycle riders were dangerous, but you turned out to be some of the most caring, generous people I've ever met. The Haven Network is going to help so many people, Jake continued. But I think the most important thing you've done is show everyone that kindness creates more kindness. When you helped us, it inspired us to help you. Now we're all working together to help other people. It's like ripples spreading out from a stone thrown into a pond. After she hung up the phone, Sarah walked outside to check on her animals one last time before bed. The stars were shining brightly in the clear August sky, and the air was warm and peaceful. As she stood in her farmyard, Sarah felt a deep sense of contentment and purpose. 3 years ago, after David died, Sarah had felt like her life was over. She had been surviving but not really living. Now, at age 32, She felt like her real life was just beginning. She had learned that helping others was not just the right thing to do. It was also the path to finding meaning and joy in life. The Haven Network would officially launch in 6 months, with coordination centers in all 50 states and parts of Canada. Sarah would serve as the national director, traveling to motorcycle rallies and community events to promote the program and recruit new volunteers. But tonight, Sarah was content to be home on her farm, surrounded by the improvements her biker friends had made, knowing that her guest rooms would soon be filled with traveling riders who had heard about her hospitality and wanted to experience it for themselves. As she turned off the lights and headed to bed, Sarah smiled as she remembered something David used to say. The best way to honor the blessings in your life is to become a blessing in someone else's life. That snowy February night when she opened her door to 20 cold strangers, Sarah had become a blessing without even realizing it. Now 6 months later, she understood that the greatest blessings in life come not from what we receive but from what we give to others.